October 1941. The Rasputitsa yields to general winter. The Russian autumn was dying, and with it died the last illusions of a quick war. Across the endless plains west of Leningrad, where birch forests gave way to swampland and primitive roads dissolved into memory, the German war machine crawled forward like a beast, already wounded, already sensing its own mortality. Hauptmann Ernst Müller stood in the turret of a half-track, binoculars pressed against a face weathered by 3 months of campaigning. He was 34 years old. In another life, he had taught history to restless boys in a Munich gymnasium, speaking of Caesar's legions and Napoleon's Grand Armée with the certainty of a man who had never heard a bullet whisper past his ear. That man was gone now, left somewhere between the Bug River and the burning villages of Byelorussia. The column stretched behind him for 3 kilometers, trucks plastered with mud, panzers grinding forward at walking pace, horses with ribs showing through matted hide, men who no longer sang the marching songs of June. The road, if it could be called a road, was a river of brown slime that swallowed wheels and boots with equal appetite. Beside the half-track, Feldwebel Otto Brenner walked with the heavy stride of a man who had seen this before. He was 41, a veteran of the last war, with eyes that held no illusions, and a face carved by 20 years of military discipline. Snow already touched his temples, though winter had not yet officially arrived.
Otto,
what did the map say about the bridge ahead? The sergeant consulted a rain-soaked paper that was dissolving in his hands. The bridge exists, Herr Hauptmann. Whether it still stands is another question.
Behind them,
the men of 3rd Platoon, 2nd Company, 11th Infantry Regiment trudged forward. 30 souls. When they crossed into Russia in June, 30 names Müller had memorized, 30 faces he saw in his dreams. Now they numbered 28. 2 were buried in unmarked graves. 400 kilometers west, swallowed by a land that seemed to have no end. Klaus Reinhardt marched near the front, 22 years old, a baker's son from Stuttgart, with soft hands that had learned hardness in 3 months. He carried the platoon's MG-34, 40 pounds of steel and death. As though it weighed nothing, his letters home spoke of victory and honor. The trembling of his hands at night told a different truth. Hans Vogel walked beside him, whistling tunelessly. He was the platoon optimist, a Dresden factory worker who believed every promise the propaganda ministry made. The war would be over by Christmas. Russia would fall, like France. The Slavs could not resist the superior German will. He whistled because the alternative was to think too much. And thinking led to questions no one wanted to answer. Werner Schroeder drove one of the supply trucks, grinding gears every few meters as the wheels spun uselessly. He was 30, married, with twin daughters he carried in a photograph next to his heart. The photograph was wrapped in oilcloth because everything in Russia was wet, always wet, as though the land itself hoped for what was coming. The younger ones clustered together. Friedrich, barely 18, who still wrote to his mother every week. Joseph, who had been a seminary student before the call-up came. Dieter, who told jokes no one laughed at anymore. Each one A universe, each one mortal. The rain fell in cold sheets, not the cleansing rain of spring or the warm summer downpours of Bavaria. This was October. Rain in Russia. Rain that carried the promise of ice. Rain that turned the world into a study, in gray and brown, and the color of old blood. Müller's orders were simple. Advance to Tikhvin. Secure the railway junction. Sever the last supply line feeding Leningrad. Simple on paper. Simple in the map rooms where generals moved pins and arrows across laminated surfaces. But here, in the mud, in the rain, with men whose boots were falling apart and trucks that consumed fuel, like drunkards consumed vodka, simplicity became a cruel joke. From the ranks came a shout, then another. The column ground to a halt with the tortured screech of metal on metal. Müller climbed down from the half-track, boots sinking immediately to his ankles. He moved forward through a line of stationary vehicles, past soldiers who watched with the dead eyes of men. Beyond exhaustion, the Panzer III sat at an angle in the road, or what remained of the road. The entire right side had sunk into a bog that appeared from nowhere, as though the earth had simply opened its mouth and decided to feed. The crew who stood beside it, covered head to foot in brown slime, staring at their trapped machine, with the helplessness of men watching a house burn. Otto appeared at Müller's shoulder. That is the third one today. Herr Hauptmann. Müller said nothing. What was there to say? They had lost more vehicles to mud than to Soviet guns. They had lost more men to dysentery and exhaustion than to combat. This was not the war they had been promised. This was not the lightning victory they had been assured. Can we recover it? Otto shook his head slowly, not without a heavy recovery vehicle. And the nearest one is probably stuck in the same mud 80 kilometers back. Müller made the calculation every commander learns to make. The mathematics of necessity. One Panzer III. Allein Timdar. 5 crew members. Fuel that would not reach them. Ammunition that would not arrive. Time measured in hours before the first snow fell and made all of this academic. Strip the ammunition and the radio. Spike the main gun. We move in 10 minutes. The crew protested, not with words but with their faces. A Panzer was not just a machine. It was protection. It was power. It was the promise that German steel could overcome Russian space. To leave it was to admit vulnerability. But Otto barked orders, and the men moved because soldiers move when sergeants bark. Because the alternative is to think about what it means to walk forward into the cold with one less shield between you and eternity. They were still stripping the Panzer when Werner Schroeder's truck, the one carrying medical supplies and the last of their coffee, slid sideways and toppled into a ditch with the slow inevitability of a falling tree. Werner jumped clear at the last second, rolling in the mud, coming up, cursing in the thick Saxon dialect no one else could quite understand. Klaus was closest. He reached down, pulled Werner up by the collar, half laughing, because laughter was the only alternative to screaming. Next time, Werner, try to keep the wheels on the ground. Werner wiped mud from his face, his eyes, his mouth. He looked at the overturned truck, at the medical supplies spilling into contaminated water, at the coffee that would not warm them through the coming nights. Something broke in his expression. Something small, but vital. They left the truck where it lay. The column moved forward. Smaller now, diminished. Behind them, the abandoned vehicles sat like tombstones marking the grave of summer's confidence. Ahead, the road, if it could be called a road, stretched toward a horizon, hidden by rain and low clouds that pressed down like a gray ceiling on the world. That night they camped in a forest clearing. If camping is what you call it, when men huddle under ponchos that leak and try to coax fire from wet wood that refuses to burn. The field kitchen managed to produce a thin soup of uncertain origin. The men ate a little without comment, because hot liquid was a blessing, and hunger had long since killed the luxury of complaint. Müller sat apart, studying maps by the light of a failing lantern. Tikhvin. The name meant nothing to him 3 months ago. Now it was everything. A small town, population maybe 60,000 before the war, built around a railway junction that connected Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. Take Tikhvin. And the noose around Leningrad tightened to strangulation. Hold Tikhvin, and 2.5 million people would starve through the winter. Simple, strategic logic. Elegant in its brutality. Otto approached with 2 tin cups, steam rising from both. He handed one to Müller without asking. It was not coffee, though it pretended to be. It was made from burned grain and optimism. But it was hot, and that was enough. The men are asking questions. Herr Hauptmann. Müller sipped the not coffee, felt it burn his throat, welcomed the pain because it meant he could still feel something. What kind of questions? The kind I do not have good answers for. How much farther to Tikhvin? Whether we will have winter clothing before the snow comes, when we might rotate back for rest. Müller stared at the map. Tikhvin was perhaps 50 kilometers northeast. On paper, 2 days of marching. In reality, in this mud, in this rain, with this exhaustion, it might as well be on the far side of the moon. Tell them we are close. Tell them winter clothing is being distributed. Tell them rest will come when the mission is complete. Otto's silence spoke volumes. They both knew these were not answers. They were the things officers say to keep men moving forward, because the only alternative is to stop. And armies that stop in Russia tend to stay there forever, frozen in place like insects in amber. The sergeant drained his cup, crushed it slightly in his fist. The men trust you, Herr Hauptmann. Klaus especially. He thinks you can keep them alive. Can I? Otto's face, carved by time and war into something beyond expression, might have shown sadness. Or perhaps it was only the failing lamplight creating shadows where none existed. That is not for me to say. Sir, I am only a sergeant. But I will tell you this. In the last war, we advanced until we could advance no more. Then we bled for 4 years in holes in the ground. And everyone who promised us victory went home to warm beds while we died in the mud. I see the same promises now. I see the same maps with the same arrows pointing east. And I see the same mud. Müller looked up sharply. You sound like a defeatist. Feldwebel. Otto met his eyes without flinching. I sound like a man who has seen this before. Herr Hauptmann, there is a difference. In the distance, beyond the rain and the darkness, came a sound that it might have been thunder, or it might have been artillery. In Russia, it was often hard to tell the difference. The men around the dying fires shifted uneasily, hands moving unconsciously to rifles that lay within reach, even in sleep. That night, Ernst Müller wrote a letter to his wife Greta, back in Munich, in the apartment near the university, where they had planned a life that now seemed impossibly distant. He told her about the rain and the mud, but not about Werner's truck or the abandoned panzers. He told her the men were in good spirits, which was true, in the way that lies become true when repeated often enough. He told her he loved her and that he would be home before she knew it. He did not mail the letter. There was no mail service that could reach them here, in this forest, in this mud, in this war, that had stopped resembling anything the propaganda had promised. He folded it carefully and placed it in the waterproof pouch with all the other letters he had written and never sent. Someday, perhaps, they would reach her. Someday when the roads were dry and the war was over and men could speak honestly about what they had done and what had been done to them. But not tonight. The rain continued. In the darkness, Friedrich cried quietly for his mother, and no one mentioned it because they had all heard the same sounds from their own throats in moments of weakness. Hans whistled his tuneless songs. Werner stared at the photograph of his daughters, memorizing faces he feared he might forget. Klaus cleaned the E for the third time that day. Because idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts in this place led nowhere good. Morning came without ceremony, a gradual lightening of the gray to a slightly paler gray. The rain had stopped, but the mud remained. Eternal, patient, indifferent. They ate cold rations and broke camp in silence. The column reformed, smaller than yesterday, smaller than it would be tomorrow. Müller checked his watch. October 16th, 1941. By the calendar, autumn. By the temperature, something colder was approaching. By the feeling in his bones, winter was not coming. It was already here, waiting just beyond the horizon, sharpening its teeth. Forward, he said. The column moved. There was nothing else to do. 3 days later, they reached Magal. The town sat astride the railway line like a key in a lock, and the Soviets defended it with the desperation of men who understood what its loss would mean. Müller's platoon was attached to the main assault force, 2 full companies supported by what remained of the armor, 6 Panzer IIIs and 4 Panzer IVs, more than half the original number left behind in mud, or abandoned with mechanical failures that could not be repaired. The attack began at dawn, October 20th, with an artillery barrage that lasted 30 minutes and accomplished less than hoped. Soviet positions were dug in deep, reinforced with railway ties and sandbags, manned by soldiers who had learned in 3 months of retreat that every meter of ground traded for time was a meter closer to winter and salvation. Müller's platoon advanced behind the panzers, using them as mobile cover, a tactic that worked until it didn't. The first tank hit a mine in the approach, track blown, crew bailing out into machine gun fire that cut down 2 before they reached cover. The second panzer made it to the first line of Soviet trenches before an anti-tank rifle, firing from a concealed position in a burned-out factory, punched through the thin side armor and turned the interior into an inferno. The platoon went to ground in shell craters and shallow ditches, returning fire at targets they could barely see. Klaus set up the MG-34 behind the corpse of a dead horse, its body already bloating in the cold, and sent long bursts into windows where muzzle flashes appeared and disappeared like fireflies. Hans threw grenades that fell short and exploded harmlessly. Friedrich, the boy who wrote to his mother, took a bullet through the shoulder and screamed until Otto crawled to him under fire and jabbed him with morphine that might or might not have been spoiled. The battle was not heroic. War rarely is. It was brutal and confused. A series of small advances and smaller retreats, men dying for reasons that made no sense in the moment and would make even less sense when examined later. But slowly, meter by meter, the German superiority in coordination and firepower began to tell. Soviet positions fell one by one. The defenders retreated to secondary lines, then tertiary, fighting from buildings and rubble, extracting the maximum cost for every street. Müller led his platoon into a factory complex, rooms filled with machinery that had once made something useful and now made only cover. They cleared it room by room, tossing grenades through doorways and following with rifle fire. A deadly choreography they had learned through repetition and survival. In one room, they found 3 Soviet soldiers, boys really, none older than 18, huddled behind an overturned lathe. The boys raised their hands. Müller gestured them to the rear. Some mercies could still be afforded. In another room, they found a family. Mother, 2 children, hiding in a corner beneath a tattered blanket, as though cloth could stop bullets. The mother stared at Müller with eyes that held no hope, only the terrible patience of someone waiting for the inevitable. The children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 6 and 8 years old, watched him with the blank curiosity of those too young to fully understand fear. Müller stared back. In another life, he had taught children this age. He had watched them struggle with Latin declensions and smiled at their mistakes. These children did not speak German, and he did not speak Russian. But the language of terror is universal. He pointed to the door, gestured for them to leave. The mother gathered her children and fled, not looking back, not questioning the mercy, because mercy questioned too closely has a way of evaporating. Klaus appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, we have the factory. Enemy withdrawing northeast." Müller nodded, not trusting his voice. They moved forward, leaving the room with its ghosts behind. Munga fell on October 21st, after 18 hours of continuous fighting. The railway junction was theirs. The supply line to Leningrad was cut. On maps in warm headquarters, pins were moved, and arrows were drawn, and reports were filed speaking of decisive victories and crumbling Soviet resistance. On the ground, in the ruins, Müller counted his platoon. 28 men when they started the assault. 24. Standing now, 1 dead. Shot through the head by a sniper he never saw. 2 wounded seriously enough to be evacuated, if evacuation was possible, which it was not. 1 missing, probably dead in the rubble, possibly captured, certainly gone. Klaus sat on a pile of bricks, cleaning the MG-34 with oil they could not spare, and care that bordered on obsession. His hand shook slightly, aftermath of adrenaline or something deeper. He had killed today, multiple times, definite kills, men who fell when he fired and did not rise again. He had expected to feel triumph, Instead, he felt nothing, and the nothing terrified him more than feeling would have. Otto distributed cigarettes, Turkish tobacco looted from a Soviet supply dump, and the men smoked in silence, watching the last fires burn in the town they had destroyed in order to capture. That evening, Müller walked through the ruins alone, unable to sleep, unable to stop moving. In the wreckage of a house, he found a photograph in a cracked frame. A Soviet family. Father in uniform. Mother in a simple dress. 3 children. Arranged by height. Everyone smiling for the camera. Everyone frozen in a moment before the war came and made such moments impossible. He left the photograph where he found it, buried under rubble, and walked on. The order to advance toward Tikhvin came the next morning. No rest, no reinforcement, just the expectation that momentum must be maintained, that victories must be exploited, that the war must be won before winter made war impossible. Müller gathered his 24 men, now 24 souls for whom he was responsible, 24 lives. He carried in his mind every waking moment. We move in 1 hour. Tikhvin is our objective. It is the key to the entire northern campaign. Take Tikhvin and Leningrad falls without another shot fired. The enemy will resist. But resistance is futile. We have the training, the discipline, the will. We will prevail because we must prevail. The words came automatically. The script every officer learns. The language of command that pretends certainty exists. The men listened because soldiers listen, because the alternative is chaos. But Müller saw in their eyes the same doubt he felt in his soul. Only Klaus still believed, or pretended to believe, which amounted to the same thing. Sir, we will take Tikhvin. For Germany, for victory. Müller put a hand on the young man's shoulder. For each other. Klaus, we do this for each other. The column reformed. Smaller now. Always smaller. They moved northeast, following roads that were barely paths, through forests that seemed to close behind them like a trap, under skies that grew darker each day, though it was still only mid-afternoon. The temperature dropped, not suddenly, but steadily, degree by degree, minute by minute. Men who had sweltered in summer heat now felt the first bite of true cold. Breath became visible. Morning frost coated the ground. At night, the puddles froze over. Thin ice that shattered under boots, but promised thicker ice to come. Still no winter clothing arrived. Headquarters sent reassuring messages. Supplies were in transit. Distribution was imminent. Trust the system. Trust the Reich. Trust that somehow, against all evidence, someone, somewhere had planned for this and would provide.
Otto,
Who had survived the last war by trusting nothing and no one except his own instincts, began hoarding every scrap of cloth he could find. Old blankets, Soviet greatcoats, stripped from dead men, anything that might provide another layer. When the real cold came, the platoon reached the outskirts of Tikhvin on November 5th. By then they numbered 22. 2 more gone, not to combat, but to sickness. Dysentery that left them too weak to march. Left behind at a field hospital that was not really a hospital, just a barn with a doctor who had no medicine and too many patients. Tikhvin sat before them, visible through the trees. It was larger than Maga, a real town with churches and factories, and streets wide enough for trucks. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lights showed in windows, quickly extinguished when Soviet watchers spotted the German approach. Somewhere in that town were Soviet soldiers preparing positions, checking weapons, making peace with whatever gods they believed in. And somewhere, though Müller did not know it yet, somewhere in Tikhvin was a railway junction that led to Leningrad. And beyond Leningrad, to the larger question of whether this war could be won or would simply consume everyone it touched. The assault order came on November 6th. The main attack would begin at first light on November 8th, 2 days to prepare, to scout positions, to rest, as much as rest was possible, when every moment brought the cold closer. Klaus cleaned his weapon. Hans whistled his tuneless melodies, softer now, as though he no longer quite believed them. Werner stared at the photograph of his daughters. Friedrich, shoulder bandaged and infected, tried not to shiver. Otto checked ammunition counts and found them lower than acceptable, higher than catastrophic, sufficient for one good fight if the fight was short. Müller walked the perimeter alone, studying the town through binoculars that fogged with his breath. Somewhere in one of those buildings was the key. Somewhere in that maze of streets was the objective. Somewhere ahead was the battle that would justify the losses, that would make the suffering mean something, that would allow them to tell themselves they had not come this far for nothing. On the evening of November 7th, Klaus approached Müller's position, carrying 2 mess tins of something that pretended to be stew.
Sir,
You need to eat. Müller accepted the tin, more for Klaus's sake than his own hunger. They ate in silence, watching the town, watching the sky, watching night fall over a land that seemed designed to swallow light and hope in equal measure. Klaus spoke quietly, almost to himself. My father was a baker.
sir.
In Stuttgart, he wanted me to learn the trade, to take over the shop. But I wanted to see the world, to be part of something bigger than kneading dough. I thought the army would give me purpose. Müller said nothing, letting the young man work through whatever needed to be said. I have killed men.
Sir,
I have watched friends die. I have done things I cannot write to my parents about. But I still believe we are here for a reason, that this matters, that when we take Tikhvin, all of this will make sense. Müller looked at Klaus, at this boy who was not a boy anymore, who had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. Hold to that belief. Klaus, we will need it tomorrow. What Müller did not say, what he could not say, was that he himself no longer knew what he believed, or whether belief mattered in a place where mud and cold and bullets made philosophy academic. November 8th arrived, with a sky the color of old iron, and a wind that carried the first real threat of snow. The temperature had dropped to -5 Celsius overnight. The ground was frozen hard enough to wring under boots. Every breath condensed into white clouds that hung in the air like the ghosts of words never spoken.
The bombardment began at 0600.
30 minutes of artillery fire that was supposed to soften Soviet positions and instead announced the German intention to every defender within 50 kilometers. Müller's platoon waited in a tree line 500 meters from the first buildings, watching shells arc overhead, watching explosions blossom in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the town begin to burn. At 0630, the guns fell silent. In the terrible quiet that followed, Müller could hear his own heartbeat, Klaus breathing beside him, Otto muttering a prayer to a god he claimed not to believe in. At 06:35, a flare rose from the command post. Green, the signal. Forward. They moved at a walk, not running, conserving energy for what would come. 22 men in a line, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning windows and corners, and any place death might be hiding. Behind them, other platoons from other companies, the massed weight of German infantry doing what German infantry had done across Europe, advancing with the terrible confidence of proven skill. The first shots came at 200 meters. Rifle fire from a church bell tower, poorly aimed, but startling in its suddenness. Klaus went prone, set up the MG-34, sent a long burst that chewed stone from the tower. The Soviet sniper either died or wisely relocated. They reached the first buildings, wooden houses, simple construction, built for lives that no longer existed. Some were already burning from the artillery. Others stood intact, deceptively peaceful. Müller's training, his 3 months of bitter experience, told him the peaceful ones were the dangerous ones. He split the platoon into 3 squads. Otto took 8 men left. Hans took 7 right. Müller kept 6, including Klaus, and moved straight ahead toward what his map identified as the railway station. The fighting that followed could not be called a battle in any grand sense. It was 1,000 small engagements, room clearings and street crossings, and moments of terror compressed into seconds that felt like hours. A Soviet soldier appeared in a doorway, fired wildly, disappeared. Klaus returned fire, the MiV tearing chunks from the door frame. They advanced, found the soldier dead in a pool of his own blood, young, maybe 20, with a letter in his pocket, written in Cyrillic, that Müller could not read, but whose meaning he understood. Hans's squad encountered resistance at an intersection. A Soviet machine gun position that pinned them for 15 minutes until a Panzer IV rolled up and blasted the position to silence with its main gun. 3 of Hans's men were wounded in the exchange. One would die before nightfall from wounds that looked superficial but shattered something vital inside. Otto's squad cleared a factory building, floor by floor, finding Soviet defenders who fought to the last round and then surrendered or died. Otto, who had learned mercy and ruthlessness in equal measure in the last war, accepted surrenders when tactical and ignored them when not. Müller's squad reached the railway station by mid-morning. It was chaos, partially destroyed by the bombardment, partially defended by what looked like a hastily assembled militia, workers with rifles and desperation. They fought from behind overturned rail cars, from ticket booths, from platform shelters. They fought badly, without coordination, but they fought. Klaus set up the MG-34 and provided covering fire, while Müller and 3 others maneuvered right, using a locomotive as cover. Grenades were thrown. Rifle fire was exchanged. A Soviet militia member, older than Müller's father, stood up to fire and took a bullet through the chest. He fell slowly, almost gracefully, and did not move again. By noon, the station was theirs. The cost had been 2 wounded. One, seriously, gut shot and beyond saving, without surgery, that one would not come in time. Müller held the man's hand while he died, whispering promises about letters home, and heroes' graves and meaning. All of it lies except the hand-holding, which was the only true comfort available. The battle for Tikhvin continued for 3 days, street by street, building by building. The Germans advanced and the Soviets retreated, exacting payment for every meter. The weather turned worse. The temperature dropped further. On November 9th, it snowed. Not the gentle flakes of childhood memory, but hard, cutting pellets that stung exposed skin and limited visibility to 50 meters. Klaus took a bullet through the calf on the second day, a through and through that was painful, but not fatal. He refused evacuation, bound the wound himself with strips torn from a Soviet flag, and continued to carry the MG-34. His limp made him slower, but his determination made him essential. Hans lost something essential in the ruins. Perhaps his optimism, perhaps his faith, perhaps simply the energy required to maintain either. After the second day, after watching another friend die from a mortar round that left nothing identifiable to bury, Hans stopped whistling. He did not stop fighting, but the music died, and with it, something vital. Werner received a letter from home, miraculous in its delivery, carried forward by some miracle of military logistics. His wife wrote about the twins, about their first day of school, about the ordinary details of life continuing in a world that still had schools and ordinary days. Werner read the letter 17 times before carefully folding it and placing it next to the photograph. He did not speak for 6 hours after that, and when he did speak again, his voice was different, harder, as though something had calcified inside. On November 11th, the Soviet resistance in Tikhvin collapsed. The defenders withdrew, some in order, some in chaos, filtering through the encircling German forces, or surrendering in small groups, hands raised, faces blank with exhaustion. By evening, a swastika flag hung from the railway station roof. By midnight, the town was declared secure. Müller's platoon, what remained of it, assembled in a warehouse that had partial roof cover and walls that blocked some of the wind. They were 17 now. 22 had entered the battle. 1 was dead from the gut wound. 2 were wounded seriously enough to be evacuated, though evacuation meant being loaded on a truck that might or might not reach a hospital, that might or might not have doctors. 2 more were missing, lost in the chaos, probably dead, possibly captured, certainly gone. 17 souls, 17 lives, 17 men for whom Ernst Müller was responsible. He looked at their faces, illuminated by a small fire they had coaxed from broken furniture. Klaus with his bandaged leg, Otto with a cut above his eye that would scar, Hans with eyes that no longer reflected light the way they once had, Werner with his photograph clutched in one hand, Friedrich barely conscious from fever, his infected shoulder now oozing pus despite Otto's best efforts. The others, names and faces and stories he knew by heart, each one irreplaceable, each one exhausted beyond measure. "We have done it," Müller said. "Tikhvin is ours. The mission is complete. The railway is severed. Leningrad is cut off. We have achieved what was asked of us." No one cheered. Victory in this place was measured in survival, not celebration. Klaus, wounded, but still believing, spoke up. "How long until we can rest?"
Sir.
"How long until we go home?" Müller had no answer. The orders from headquarters spoke of consolidation and defense, and preparing for the spring offensive. They spoke of everything except rest, except home, except the promises made in summer that now seemed like stories told to children. Soon, Klaus, rest will come soon. It was a lie, but it was a kind lie, the sort that officers tell when the truth is unbearable. That night, as 17 men slept the sleep of the utterly depleted, Müller sat alone with his thoughts and his maps, and the weight of command that grew heavier with each passing day. Outside, the wind howled. The temperature dropped to -12. The first real snow began to fall, thick flakes that accumulated quickly, covering the ruins, covering the blood, covering everything in a white shroud. And somewhere in that warehouse, Klaus Reinhardt dreamed of home, of his father's bakery, of bread rising in warm ovens, of a life that seemed increasingly distant and impossible. At 0300, Klaus Reinhardt died not from his leg wound, which had been clean and manageable. He died from infection that raced through his system with the speed of fire through dry timber. He died from lack of antibiotics that existed somewhere in the supply chain but had not reached forward positions. He died from cold that lowered resistance and made every wound potentially fatal. He died from the accumulated weight of 3 months at war, from exhaustion and stress, and the 1,000 small insults to the body that eventually demand payment. Otto found him first, cold and still, eyes open to a ceiling he could no longer see. The sergeant closed those eyes gently, with the practiced care of a man who had performed this service too many times. Müller came when summoned. He knelt beside the body of the young man who had believed when belief was hardest. Klaus's hand still clutched the letter he had been writing to his parents, unfinished, ink frozen on the page. The letter spoke of victory and honor and coming home soon. It spoke of Tikhvin taken and the war nearly won. It spoke of all the things Klaus had needed to believe, to keep moving forward. Müller took the letter, folded it carefully, placed it in the oilcloth pouch with all the other letters to families who waited for sons who would not return. In Klaus's breast pocket, they found a second letter, already sealed and addressed. The address was in Stuttgart, a bakery on Hauptstrasse. Klaus had written it days earlier, perhaps sensing what was coming, perhaps simply being thorough. The letter was for his parents. Müller did not open it. Some final words were too private for even commanding officers to read. They buried Klaus Reinhardt that morning in frozen ground that resisted the shovel with malicious stubbornness. 16 men stood at attention while Otto said words that might have been a prayer, or might have been a curse, or might have been both. There was no chaplain. There was no flag. There was only the hole in the ground and the body wrapped in a Soviet greatcoat because they had nothing else. Hans placed Klaus's helmet at the head of the grave, a marker that would last until the next artillery barrage or the next snowfall made all markers meaningless. Werner spoke, his voice rough. He believed we would win. He believed we were doing something that mattered. I hope he was right. No one answered. There was no answer to give. They filled in the grave and walked away, leaving Klaus Reinhardt in Tikhvin, in Russia, in the mud and snow and cold, forever. 22 years old, forever believing forever gone. That afternoon, as the men tried to warm themselves around fires that gave more smoke than heat, the snow intensified. What had been flurries became a storm. Visibility dropped to meters. The temperature plunged to -18 Celsius and kept falling. Müller stood in the doorway of the warehouse, watching the snow accumulate with terrifying speed. Already, it was ankle-deep. By nightfall, it would be knee-deep. By morning, perhaps waist-deep. Otto joined him, collar turned up against the wind. Frost already forming in his eyebrows. It is early for this much snow. Herr Hauptmann, even for Russia. Müller watched the white curtain descend on the town they had paid for in blood. How much winter clothing has arrived? None.
Sir.
Headquarters says it is in transit. How much fuel for the vehicles? Enough for perhaps 3 days of normal operations. Less if we need heat. How much ammunition? Enough for one serious engagement. After that, we will be throwing snowballs. Müller might have laughed if laughter was still something he remembered how to do. What do you think, Otto? You who have seen all this before, what do you think comes next? The old sergeant was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow, watching the town, watching the future arrive in white silence. In the last war, Herr Hauptmann, we won every battle for 4 years. We advanced and retreated and advanced again. We held every position we were ordered to hold. We followed every order without question. And in the end, we lost, not because we were weak, but because we mistook motion for progress. Because we believed the maps instead of the ground. Because we thought will could overcome reality. He paused, then continued. I think we have just won a town that will kill us. I think we have just achieved an objective that will become our grave. I think General Winter has arrived, and he does not care about our flags, or our victories, or our orders. He only cares about cold. And cold, Herr Hauptmann, is patient. Cold. Cold can wait. Müller had no response. In the warehouse behind them, 16 men tried to sleep. 16 men who trusted him to keep them alive, to lead them home, to make all of this suffering mean something. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The wind howled like wolves, or ghosts, or the future announcing its arrival. The temperature dropped another degree, then another, and in a grave marked by a helmet, already half buried in snow, Klaus Reinhardt lay silent. Beyond cold, beyond fear, beyond the promises that had brought him here. November 11th, 1941. Tikhvin had fallen. The German flag flew over the railway station. On maps, in warm rooms far away, the encirclement of Leningrad was complete. But in the streets, in the ruins, in the cold that cut like knives, and the snow that buried everything it touched, Ernst Müller felt the first whisper of a truth he did not want to acknowledge. They had won, but winning in this place, at this time, might be the most dangerous thing they could have done. The snow fell. Winter had arrived. And victory, he was beginning to understand, might taste exactly like ashes. November 12th, 1941. The cold arrived not as weather, but as an invading force. The thermometer outside the warehouse headquarters read -20 Celsius at dawn. By noon, it had dropped to -25. By evening, -30. The mercury fell with the relentless inevitability of a guillotine blade, and there was nothing human will or German discipline could do to stop it. Ernst Müller woke on the 5th morning of occupation to find ice crystals forming on the inside of the warehouse walls. His breath emerged in white clouds so thick they obscured vision. The fire they had maintained through the night had died to embers that gave no warmth, only the memory of warmth, which was somehow worse than nothing at all. Around him, 16 men died, slowly, reluctantly, bodies protesting the transition from unconsciousness to the waking nightmare of cold. They were wrapped in every scrap of fabric they possessed. Soviet greatcoats over German uniforms, blankets stolen from abandoned homes, newspapers stuffed into boots and wrapped around torsos for insulation that barely existed. They looked less like soldiers of the Wehrmacht and more like refugees, like the displaced persons they had seen fleeing westward in the summer, like victims rather than victors. Otto was already awake, had been for hours, pacing the perimeter, because to stop moving was to invite the cold deeper into bones that already ached with it. His face had aged a decade in 5 days. Frost clung to his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. When he spoke, his words emerged broken, punctuated by the chatter of teeth he could not control. Herr Hauptmann, we have a problem. Müller pulled himself upright, every joint protesting, every muscle stiff. The simple act of standing required more effort than it should have. His fingers, even inside gloves that were inadequate, had lost most sensation. He flexed them experimentally, wondering if the numbness was temporary or the first stage of something worse. What kind of problem? All of them.
Sir.
Every kind there is. The fuel they had hoarded for the vehicles had frozen overnight. Not the fuel itself, which was diesel, but the filters and lines and all the delicate mechanisms that allowed combustion engines to function. 3 trucks sat in the street outside, useless metal sculptures that might as well have been decorative for all the good they would do. The half-tracks were in similar condition. Even the Panzer IIIs, the armored pride of the Wehrmacht, sat silent and dead, their engines seized by cold that penetrated steel as easily as it penetrated flesh. Otto had tried to start one that morning, following the manual precisely, doing everything by the book. The starter motor had groaned once, a sound like a dying animal, and then fallen silent. No amount of coaxing would revive it. What about the radios? Dead.
Sir.
Batteries frozen. We have one field telephone that still functions, but the line to headquarters was cut sometime during the night. Partisans, probably, or perhaps just the weight of snow on the wire. Müller absorbed this information with the numb acceptance of a man beyond surprise. They were cut off. No vehicles, no communications, no way to call for support or supplies or evacuation. They were 17 men, now reduced to medieval technology, muskets and muscle and whatever they could carry on their backs. Food supplies. Otto's expression said everything before his words confirmed it. 3 days of half rations, if we are careful. 5 if we are desperate. The convoy that was supposed to arrive yesterday has not appeared. I do not think it is coming. Why not? Because they are as stuck as we are. Herr Hauptmann. Or they are dead in a ditch somewhere. Or they never left the depot because someone finally admitted that the roads are impassable and the cold will kill the drivers before they travel 20 kilometers. Müller moved to the doorway, looked out at the town they had conquered. Tikhvin sat under a blanket of snow that was already waist-deep and growing deeper. The streets were empty. No civilians moved. The Soviet population had either fled or was huddled in cellars, conserving warmth and food, waiting for something to change. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, proof that some fires still burned, that some life persisted. But the town felt dead. It felt like a place that had been abandoned by everything except cold and silence and the slow strangulation of winter. Behind him, Friedrich's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a labor. The infection in his shoulder had spread despite everything. Black lines now radiating from the wound site. Sepsis. Otto had said quietly the night before, "We have nothing to treat it. He will not last the week." Werner sat against a wall, photograph clutched in hands that trembled continuously. He stared at the images of his daughters, but Müller suspected he no longer saw them. Not really. He saw ghosts. He saw futures that would never arrive. His lips moved soundlessly, perhaps praying, perhaps simply speaking to people who could not hear him. Across the thousands of kilometers that might as well have been infinite. This was victory. This was what winning looked like in Russia in November, when winter decided to show its true face. Müller made the rounds of his men, speaking quiet words of encouragement that felt hollow even as he spoke them. Help was coming. Winter clothing was being distributed. This was temporary. All lies. But lies were all he had to offer. And sometimes lies were more valuable than truths. The day passed with the glacial slowness of all days in hell. There was nothing to do except survive. They scavenged wood from destroyed buildings to feed fires that gave barely enough heat to keep water from freezing. They melted snow for drinking water, a process that consumed fuel and time and gave back liquid that tasted of ash and something chemical. They ate cold rations from tins that required body heat to thaw enough to open. Friedrich's condition deteriorated through the afternoon. By evening, he was delirious, calling for his mother, calling for water. They could only provide by melting snow, over fires they could barely maintain. Otto pulled Müller aside, spoke in a whisper that the cold made visible. Friedrich will not last the night. The infection has reached his blood. There is nothing more we can do. Can we do anything? The sergeant's silence was answer enough. Friedrich died just after midnight, quietly, his fevered mutterings finally ceasing, his labored breathing stopping without drama or fanfare. They covered him with the blanket they could not spare, but gave anyway, because some gestures matter more than survival. They could not bury him. The ground was frozen iron hard. They carried his body outside, placed it in a doorway of a collapsed building, covered it with snow. It was not a grave. It was barely a marker, but it was all they could manage. 15 men remained. That night, the temperature dropped to -35 Celsius. It was a cold that defied description. A cold that made breathing painful, that turned exposed skin white and dead in minutes, that penetrated every layer of clothing and found the warmth of the body and strangled it. Men huddled together for survival, dignity abandoned in favor of shared body heat. They did not sleep so much as lose consciousness in intervals, waking every hour to feed the fire or check that their extremities still had sensation. Müller lay awake, unable to find even temporary oblivion. His mind raced with calculations that led nowhere. They had ammunition for perhaps 2 engagements, food for 3 days, fuel for fires for maybe a week if they scavenged aggressively. No communications, no transport, no way out. On paper, they held Tikhvin. The railway junction was theirs. The strategic objective was achieved. But what did control mean when they could not move, could not resupply, could not even maintain basic human function? They were prisoners in the town they had conquered, trapped, as surely as if the Soviets had locked them in a cage. Otto's words from weeks earlier echoed in his consciousness. I think we have just won. A town that will kill us. The old sergeant had been right. Victory was a poison. They had swallowed it, and now it was destroying them from within. Morning came. Though the sun was a pale ghost behind clouds that promised more snow. November 14th, 6 days since they had raised the swastika over Tikhvin. 6 days that felt like 6 months. Werner did not wake with the others. Müller found him in the corner where he had spent the night, photograph still clutched in frozen hands, eyes open and glazed. For a moment, Müller thought the man had simply died of cold, another casualty of winter's grinding attrition. Then he saw the Luger on the ground beside him, saw the small hole in Werner's right temple, saw the frozen spray of blood and brain matter on the wall behind. Werner Schroeder, 30 years old, father of twin daughters he would never see again, had chosen the bullet over the slow freeze. He had made the calculation that many were beginning to make, that death by one's own hand was preferable to death by degrees, that there was dignity in choosing the moment rather than letting winter choose it for you. Müller knelt beside the body, pried the photograph from stiff fingers. 2 girls, perhaps 5 years old, smiling at a camera, unaware that their father was already dead, in a Russian town they would never be able to find on a map. He placed the photograph in his breast pocket, next to Klaus's unfinished letter, next to all the other accumulated debris of shattered lives. Otto appeared at his shoulder. We need to address the men.
Sir.
This is the second death in 3 days. Morale is breaking. Morale? Müller thought, as though morale was something that still existed, as though spirit and discipline could survive minus 35 degrees, and starvation, and the absolute certainty that no help was coming. He gathered the 14 survivors, these ghosts wearing Wehrmacht uniforms, these men who lured him with eyes that held no hope, only the patience of those waiting for permission to stop fighting. Werner chose his own path. Müller said, I will not judge that choice. Each man must decide for himself what he can endure. But I ask you, I beg you, to endure a little longer. Help is coming. Winter clothing is being distributed. Reinforcements are on the way. We must hold Tikhvin. We must maintain the encirclement of Leningrad. We must make the sacrifices we have already made mean something. The words were ashes in his mouth even as he spoke them. The men listened because they were conditioned to listen to officers. But their faces showed no belief. They had heard these promises before. They had believed them once. Now they knew better. The days that followed blurred together into a continuous nightmare of cold and hunger and slow deterioration. The temperature did not rise. If anything, it fell further, dropping to -40 on November 17th. A cold so profound that it seemed to stop time itself, to freeze the world into a stillness broken only by the wind that screamed like the damned. They burned furniture, doors, floorboards, anything combustible. They wrapped themselves in Soviet flags and Nazi banners with equal disregard for symbolism. Because fabric was fabric and ideology gave no warmth. They huddled and shivered and tried to remember what it felt like to be warm, really warm, skin-deep warm, and found they could not. Frostbite claimed its harvest. Toes turned black and fell off. Fingers lost all sensation and refused to bend. Ears swelled and burst like overripe fruit. Otto performed amputations with a bayonet heated in the fire, cutting away dead tissue while men screamed or bit down on leather belts. Because there was no morphine left and pain was better than gangrene. Over the next week, 6 more men succumbed to the cold. 3 lost so many toes they could no longer walk. 2 developed gangrene in their hands that spread despite amputations. 1 simply stopped waking one morning, his body having surrendered to conditions it was never designed to endure. When the Soviet scout appeared at the edge of town on November 25th, only 8 men could still fight. 8 souls out of 30 who had crossed into Russia in June. 8 ghosts who could barely hold rifles, who shivered continuously, who stared with hollow eyes at a horizon that promised nothing except more cold and more deaths. On November 20th, something changed. It began with a soldier on watch, one of the 8 still capable of standing guard, suddenly gripping Müller's arm.
Sir,
I hear voices, Russian voices. They are coming. Müller moved to a window, peered through a crack in the boards they had used to block the wind. At first, he saw nothing except white on white, snow and more snow. Then shapes resolved. Men in white winter camouflage, moving with the practiced ease of those who belong to this landscape. Soviet soldiers, or partisans, or something else entirely. Not attacking, not yet, but scouting, probing, testing the German positions. He watched one figure detach from the group, ski forward with fluid grace, stop perhaps 300 meters distant. The figure raised binoculars, swept them across the German positions. For a moment, Müller felt those distant eyes settle on his window, on him, a connection across the snow and cold and the mathematics of violence. Then the figure lowered the binoculars and skied away, vanishing into the white as though he had never existed. They are preparing something, Otto said. Reconnaissance before an assault. With what? Müller asked. We have heard no vehicle engines. We have seen no massed formations. How do they even move in this cold? They are Russian.
sir,
Perhaps they do not feel it the way we do. But even as he spoke, Otto knew it was more than that. Something had changed in the Soviet forces. Something fundamental. These were not the disorganized troops they had fought in October, not the militia hastily thrown into the line. These were professionals, confident, prepared. Over the next 3 days, the probing intensified. Soviet scouts appeared at dawn and dusk, ghostly figures in white, never close enough for effective rifle fire. Always watching, always assessing. German sentries shot at them occasionally, wasting ammunition on targets that melted away into the landscape. Twice, Soviet snipers fired from concealed positions, wounding 2 men. The shots came from impossible distances, from angles that should not have had clear line of sight. Müller tried to organize a response, but his men were too weak, too cold, too depleted. A patrol, sent to investigate a Soviet position, returned with 1 man down from frostbite after 30 minutes in the open. The lesson was clear. Movement was death. They could defend what they held, but they could not maneuver, could not attack, could barely function. They were warriors reduced to invalids, soldiers who had conquered a position they could no longer hold. On November 25th, at first light, something new appeared on the horizon. Otto saw them first, standing watch in the frozen dawn. He called Müller urgently, voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Herr Hauptmann, you need to see this." Müller climbed to the 2nd floor of the warehouse, to a window with a clear view east. He raised binoculars, adjusted focus, and felt his breath catch. The Soviet forces were deploying, not in small scout groups, but in strength. Hundreds of men, perhaps thousands, moving through the forest at the edge of town with the disciplined coordination of veteran units. But it wasn't the numbers that froze the blood in Müller's veins. It was what they wore, how they moved, the casual competence with which they handled the cold. These soldiers were not shivering. They were not huddled or desperate. They wore proper winter uniforms, thick sheepskin tulips, and Valenki felt boots and fur hats with ear flaps. They moved on skis with the grace of men who had been born on snow. They set up positions with the efficiency of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Otto spoke quietly. "Siberians."
Sir.
"Those are Siberian divisions." "How do you know?" "The way they move, the equipment, the fact that they are not dying in this cold. These are not conscripts from Moscow or Kiev. These are men from places where -40 is normal, where winter is not an enemy, but an ally." Müller watched as the Soviet forces established positions, brought up what looked like artillery, organized supply lines that functioned, despite conditions that had paralyzed the Germans. It was impossible. It defied everything he understood about military logistics and human endurance, but it was happening before his eyes. He lowered the binoculars, mind racing through tactical calculations that all led to the same conclusion. We cannot hold against a determined assault. Not with 8 effective soldiers, not with no support, not with no communications. Then we must hope they do not assault. Otto said, "We must hope they are as frozen and desperate as we are." But the hope was thin, and both men knew it. That afternoon, a Soviet scout was captured, not through German action, but through the scout's own misfortune. A broken sky that left him vulnerable during a probe that went wrong. 2 German sentries brought him in, hands bound, face showing more annoyance than fear. Müller studied the prisoner. The man was perhaps 28, short and compact, with Mongol features and narrow eyes that revealed nothing. He wore the thick winter uniform of the Siberian divisions, appeared completely unbothered by temperatures that were killing Germans through simple exposure. When offered water, he drank. When offered food, he ate. He showed no distress, no discomfort, only the professional patience of a soldier who had been captured and was waiting to see what came next.
Otto,
who spoke some Russian learned in the last war. Attempted interrogation. The prisoner answered some questions, ignored others, lied about a few, but certain facts emerged. The 65th Siberian Rifle Division had arrived. More divisions were coming. The Soviet High Command had ordered the recapture of Tikhvin. An assault was being prepared. When asked when the assault would come, the prisoner smiled slightly. Soon enough. Winter is our ally. Winter does not hurry. They locked him in a cellar, posted a guard, and returned to the desperate calculations of defense. Müller spread his pitiful forces as well as he could, positioning the 8 men who could still fight to cover the most likely approaches. It was futile, and he knew it. 8 men could not hold a town against a division. 8 frozen, starving, desperate men could barely hold a building. That night, Müller could not sleep despite exhaustion that went beyond the physical. His mind kept returning to the Soviet prisoner, to his calm acceptance, to the way he had smiled when speaking of winter. The man had not been mocking. He had been stating simple fact. Winter was their ally, and winter was killing the Germans more effectively than any bullet. Far to the east, beyond the frozen forests and the lines of white-clad soldiers preparing their assault, beyond the calculations of generals and the movements of divisions, a different story was unfolding. In Leningrad, 200 kilometers west, the siege that had begun in September was tightening its grip with methodical cruelty. The ration had been cut again. 125 grams of bread per day for civilians. Bread that was more sawdust than flour, that filled the stomach without providing nutrition, that delayed starvation without preventing it. In a basement of Hospital Number 17, Anna Volkov worked by the light of a single candle, rationing medicine that would run out within days, treating wounds. She had no supplies to properly dress, watching people die from injuries that would have been survivable in peacetime. She was 24 years old, trained as a nurse in a world where hospitals had electricity and antibiotics and hope. That world was gone now, replaced by this frozen hell where death came not from bombs, but from hunger. Not from bullets, but from coal. Not from violence, but from the simple mathematics of a city, cut off from everything that sustained life. Her husband had died at Maga in September. She had received the notification in October, a brief form letter that spoke of heroic sacrifice and the gratitude of the motherland. She had not cried. There was no energy left for tears. She had simply folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and returned to work, because work was all that remained. Work and survival, and the slim hope that somehow Leningrad would endure. Every evening, when the hospital quieted and the dying slept their restless sleep, Anna made her way to a hidden room in the basement where an illegal radio transmitter still functioned. The broadcasts were forbidden. Of course, the NKVD would execute anyone caught operating unauthorized communications. But someone had to tell the truth. Someone had to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. On the evening of November 25th, Anna sat before the microphone, hands shaking from cold and hunger and exhaustion, and spoke into the darkness. This is Leningrad calling. This is the voice of a city that refuses to die. Today we buried 200. Tomorrow we will bury more. The ration has been cut again. Children are dying in their mother's arms. The elderly simply close their eyes and do not open them again. But Tikhvin still stands between us and salvation. Tikhvin, where the railway runs, where food might come if the line could be opened. Tikhvin, which the fascists hold and which must be retaken if Leningrad is to survive. She paused, gathering strength. To the soldiers moving toward Tikhvin, to the Siberian divisions we hear are coming, we say this: we are counting on you. 2 million souls are counting on you. Take back our lifeline. Open the railway. Save this city. Because if Tikhvin remains in German hands, Leningrad will become a grave for everyone who remains. The broadcast was brief, less than 3 minutes, before she shut down the equipment and hid it again. She did not know if anyone heard. She did not know if the words mattered, but speaking them mattered, because silence was surrender. And Anna Volkov had decided months ago that she would not surrender, not while breath remained, not while Leningrad still stood. November 30th arrived with winds that made -40 feel even colder, with snow that fell horizontally, with visibility measured in meters. It was a day when nothing should move, when all sensible creatures should shelter and wait for the storm to pass. The Soviet attack came at dawn, not a frontal assault, but something more sophisticated. Infiltration teams on skis, moving through the storm like ghosts, appearing from nowhere, striking German positions, vanishing before effective response was possible. They knew the town better than the Germans did, knew every alley and shortcut, knew where to hit and when to withdraw. Müller's men fought as well as frozen. Exhausted soldiers could fight. They fired at shapes in the snow. They defended their positions with the stubbornness of men who had nowhere to retreat. But it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. By noon, one of Müller's strong points had been overrun. 3 men dead, 2 wounded. The position abandoned because holding it meant dying in it. The survivors withdrew to the warehouse. The 8 effective soldiers, now reduced to 5, and the wounded count growing. Müller stood at the warehouse entrance, rifle in hands that barely had strength to hold it, watching the Soviet forces probe and test and prepare for the final push. Somewhere in that mass of white-clad soldiers, somewhere in the professional competence of the Siberian divisions, was the man who would kill him. Perhaps a sniper waiting for a clean shot. Perhaps an assault trooper who would throw the grenade or fire the burst that ended Ernst Müller's war. He found himself thinking of Klaus, believing to the end, of Werner, choosing the bullet over the freeze, of Friedrich, dying while calling for his mother, of all the men he had led from Germany to this frozen corner of hell, this town that had promised strategic victory and delivered only death. Otto appeared beside him, face gray with exhaustion and something deeper.
Sir,
We need to consider withdrawal. We cannot hold here. We will all die here. Our orders are to hold Tikhvin at all costs. Our orders were written by men who are not freezing to death in a warehouse. Our orders did not account for -40 degrees and Siberian divisions, and the fact that we are 5 men trying to hold a town against 1,000. Müller wanted to argue, wanted to cite duty and discipline, and the oath they had all sworn, but the words would not come. Otto was right. Holding Tikhvin meant dying in Tikhvin. And death achieved nothing except adding more bodies to the snow. If we withdraw, where do we go? The roads are impassable. The vehicles are frozen. We would die in the open. Faster than we will die here. Then we die here.
Sir.
But we die choosing to stay. Not because we are too stubborn or too disciplined to admit the truth. We die because this is where we made our stand, and winter won. Before Müller could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the southern edge of the town. Not scattered shots, but sustained fire. Multiple weapons. The Soviet probing had become an assault. They moved without discussion. 5 men forming a fighting retreat toward their final defensive position, the warehouse, the place where they had slept and frozen and watched their comrades die. Now it would be their Alamo, their last stand, their grave. The Soviet assault was professional, methodical, overwhelming. They advanced in coordinated teams, suppressing German positions with precise fire while others maneuvered. They used the storm for cover, appearing and disappearing like demons. They showed no hesitation, no fear, only the calm execution of men who knew they had already won. Müller's 5 men fought with the desperation of the doomed. They fired until rifles overheated despite the cold. They threw their last grenades. They fell back room by room, floor by floor, making the Soviets pay for every meter, but paying a steeper price themselves. 2 more fell to Soviet fire, shot through windows they were defending, dead before they hit the ground. 3 men remained, 3 out of the 30 who had crossed into Russia in June, 3 out of the 28 who had attacked Tikhvin. 3 soldiers crouched in a warehouse that smelled of smoke and blood and defeat. Otto checked ammunition counts. We have perhaps 20 rounds each. After that, bayonets. Müller looked at the men. At faces he knew as well as his own. At eyes that held no reproach, no blame, only acceptance. They had followed him this far. They would follow him to the end. But what was the end? Death by Soviet bullets. Death by cold. Surrender. And the uncertainty of Soviet captivity. Or something else. Before he could decide, a voice called out in accented German. German soldiers, you are surrounded. You have fought well. There is no shame in surrender. Lay down your weapons, and you will be treated according to the laws of war. Müller moved to a window, peered out, 50 meters away, standing in the open with the confidence of one who knows he is untouchable, was a Soviet sergeant to him, not tall, but solid, dressed in the sheepskin tulip of the Siberians, face weathered by more than this war. He held no weapon, only a white flag, improvised from what looked like a bedsheet. Müller called back, "Who are you?" "Anya. I am Sergeant Alexei Volkov, 65th Siberian Rifle Division. I am offering you the chance to live. It is a chance I suggest you take." "Why?" "Because you have fought well. Because your men deserve better than to die in this frozen warehouse. Because winter is the real enemy, and winter shows no mercy to the brave or the foolish. Because I tell you, the one soldier to another, this battle is over." Müller looked at Otto, at the other survivor, saw in their faces the question they could not ask. Surrender. After everything, after Klaus and Werner and Friedrich and all the others, After taking this cursed town and holding it against all odds,
Or die here.
proving nothing except that German stubbornness could match Russian cold. The decision was his to make. Command was a burden. Leadership meant choosing, and sometimes choosing meant admitting defeat. He thought of Greta, back in Munich, of the letters he had written and never sent, of the life they had planned that now seemed like a story told about different people in a different world. If he died here, she would receive a telegram. He fell for Führer and fatherland. She would cry and grieve and eventually,
Perhaps move on.
another widow in a nation of widows. But if he surrendered, if he survived, there was a chance, however slim, that someday he might see her again, that someday he might sit in their apartment and tell her the truth about Russia and winter and the price of victory, that someday he might be something other than a frozen corpse in a town no one would remember. He made the decision. We surrender. Otto nodded slowly, no judgment in his expression, only relief. The other man set down his rifle, exhausted beyond measure, grateful to have the choice taken from him. Müller walked to the door, opened it to the killing cold, stepped out into the snow with his hands raised. His men followed, 3 ghosts emerging from the warehouse, 3 survivors of a battle that had consumed 30 souls and gained nothing except a lesson written in blood on frozen ground. Volkov approached slowly, flanked by soldiers who kept weapons ready but not aimed. The Siberian sergeant stopped 2 meters away, studied Müller with eyes that had seen much and judged little. You fought well, the sergeant said. In different circumstances, perhaps we would share vodka and speak of this battle with respect. But circumstances are what they are. Müller met those eyes, saw neither triumph nor contempt. Only acknowledgement. Why did you offer terms? You could have simply killed us. Volkov shrugged slightly. Because winter will kill enough men on both sides before this war ends. Because I have killed enough today and take no joy in killing those who can no longer fight. Because you remind me of myself, German officer, doing your duty, following orders, trying to keep your men alive in a war neither of us started. He gestured, and Soviet soldiers moved forward, not roughly, but firm, searching the Germans for weapons, binding their hands, leading them away from the warehouse that had been their world. Müller took one last look at Tikhvin, at the town they had conquered at such cost, at the snow-covered streets and frozen buildings, and the graves of friends who would never leave this place. Somewhere in that snow lay Klaus and Friedrich and Werner and all the others. Somewhere in the cold was the wreckage of German confidence, the death of summer's certainties. As they marched him toward the Soviet lines, toward captivity and an uncertain future, Müller heard a new sound, distant. From the west, artillery, the thunder of guns that might be German counter-battery fire, or might be Soviet reinforcements announcing their arrival, or might simply be the war continuing without him. The sound faded as they moved east, away from Tikhvin, away from the front, away from everything except the cold and the snow and the sure knowledge that the war he had known was over. And whatever came next would be written by different men in different places. Behind them, in the warehouse where 3 men had made their last stand, the fires died one by one. Snow began to drift through broken windows, covering everything, erasing all evidence the Germans had ever been there. By morning, the warehouse would be just another ruin in a town full of ruins, and the wind would howl through empty rooms where ghosts told stories no one was left to hear. December 1st, 1941. Ernst Müller, teacher of history, soldier of the Wehrmacht, prisoner of war, walked east into the gathering dark. And in Tikhvin, winter smiled, patient and eternal, waiting for the next victims to stumble into its embrace. December 5th, 1941. 4 days into captivity, the Soviet column moved west through the forest. A line of trucks and sleds carrying prisoners and supplies toward the collection points where German POWs would be sorted, processed, and sent to camps deep in the Russian interior. Ernst Müller sat at the back of a truck with 11 other Germans, all that remained from various shattered units pulled from Tikhvin's ruins. His hands were bound, not tightly, but firmly enough to prevent escape. Not that escape was possible. Outside the canvas covering, the temperature held at -38. To run was to die frozen within the hour. Beside him, Otto sat in silence, face expressionless, eyes watching everything. The old sergeant had survived capture with the same stoic acceptance he had shown for everything else. Survival was a skill, and Otto had mastered it across 2 wars and 25 years of service. The truck lurched over frozen ruts, the driver fighting a road that existed more in theory than practice. Through gaps in the canvas, Müller caught glimpses of the convoy. 8 trucks, perhaps 60 prisoners total, escorted by 2 squads of Soviet infantry. Professional soldiers, Siberians most likely, moving with the practiced ease of men, for whom this cold was merely weather, not a death sentence. Somewhere ahead in the column, though Müller could not see him, was Sergeant Alexei Volkov, the man who had offered terms and kept his word, the man who had shown mercy when mercy was not required. Müller found himself thinking about Volkov, about the strange professional courtesy between soldiers who recognized in each other a shared understanding of duty's weight. The convoy stopped twice for mechanical issues. Soviet trucks were more reliable in the cold than German ones, but nothing was immune to -40 degrees. Each stop brought anxiety. The Germans huddled in the trucks, dreading being ordered out into the killing cold. But the stops were brief, repairs made with impressive efficiency, and the convoy moved on. They had been traveling for 6 hours when the shooting started. It came without warning, as ambushes always do. One moment, the truck was grinding forward through the forest. The next, the world exploded in gunfire and shouting, and the screech of metal on metal. The truck swerved violently, threw prisoners against each other, came to a shuddering halt, tilted at a sharp angle. Otto moved first, driven by instincts honed across decades. He tore at the canvas covering, pulled himself through the opening, disappeared into chaos. Müller followed, hands still bound, hitting the frozen ground and rolling. Coming up, behind the truck's bulk, the scene was madness. German infantry, perhaps a company's strength, were attacking the convoy from both sides of the road. They came from tree lines 200 meters out, advancing in coordinated rushes, suppressing fire, forcing the Soviet escort to take cover. Panzerfaust rockets streaked through the air. One struck a truck at the head of the column, turning it into a fireball that illuminated the forest in orange hell. Soviet soldiers returned fire with professional discipline, but they were outnumbered and surprised. The Siberians fell back to defensive positions, using the trucks as cover, buying time for someone to organize a response. In the chaos, prisoners scattered. Some ran into the forest, choosing the cold over the crossfire. Others huddled where they were, hands over heads, praying that random bullets would find someone else. A few, the ones with soldiers' instincts, looked for weapons among the Soviet dead. Müller found Otto already armed with a Soviet rifle taken from a body, working to cut his bonds against a sharp edge of metal. The sergeant freed himself. Then Müller began looking for others from their platoon.
Sir,
This is a rescue operation. German forces are counterattacking to retake Tikhvin. We need to link up with them. Muller's mind counterattack. With what forces? Every unit in the sector had been as depleted and frozen as his own. Where had fresh troops come from? But the questions were academic. The shooting was real. The opportunity was real, and capture had taught him something essential. He wanted to live. They moved toward the German lines, using smoke and confusion as cover, Otto leading with the competence of a man who had done this before. 2 other survivors joined them, then 3 more from other units. 7 men, armed with Soviet weapons. No winter clothing, but free. The German attack was fierce but brief. The element of surprise spent facing disciplined Siberian resistance. The counterattacking force began to withdraw. An officer Müller did not recognize, a lieutenant with a face blackened by frostbite, grabbed survivors and organized a fighting retreat. Fall back into the secondary line. 2 kilometers west, move. They moved, because soldiers move when orders are given in combat. They half ran, half stumbled through knee-deep snow, lungs burning from cold air, following the retreating Germans toward whatever secondary line meant. Behind them, Soviet forces, reorganized, began pursuit, but cautiously, unwilling to be drawn into an ambush. The secondary line turned out to be a hastily fortified position in an abandoned collective farm, a collection of buildings surrounding a central square, occupied by perhaps 80 German soldiers from half a dozen shattered units. The survivors of the rescue operation stumbled in, were given positions, became part of a defense that was already desperate. A Hauptmann named Dietrich, gaunt and hollow-eyed, briefed the newcomers. The counteroffensive began 3 days ago. High Command sent everything they could spare. We retook some ground, freed some prisoners. But the Siberians are pushing back hard. This position is our rally point. We hold here until relieved or ordered to withdraw. When will relief come? Someone asked. Dietrich's expression said everything. There would be no relief. There was nothing left to send. This was the high water mark of German power in the Tikhvin sector, and the tide was already receding. Müller found himself assigned to the southern approach. Otto at his side, commanding a squad of 8 men he had never met before. They prepared positions in the ruins of a barn, stacking frozen sandbags, clearing fire lanes, doing all the things the soldiers do when preparing to sell their lives expensively. That night, huddled in the frozen barn with men who were strangers but brothers.
Müller realized the peculiar mathematics of war.
4 days ago, he had surrendered, accepting capture, accepting that his war was over. Now he was back in the fight, back in command, back in the position of responsibility for lives that might end at any moment. The war, it seemed, was not done with him. Otto distributed ammunition. Soviet 7 62-meter rounds for the Mosin Nagant rifles they had taken. A handful of grenades. Nothing else. No food. No winter clothing. No illusions. How long do you think we can hold? Feldwebel. Otto checked the action on his rifle. A gesture that was more ritual than necessary. Long enough for it to matter. Herr Hauptmann, or not long enough at all. Does it make a difference? It did not. The Soviet assault came at dawn on December 10th, preceded by artillery that was mercifully brief but terrifyingly accurate. Shells walked across the collective farm with mechanical precision, destroying the command post, collapsing buildings, killing 6 men before the infantry even appeared. They came from the east and north simultaneously. White-clad soldiers moving through the snow like wolves. Professional and patient. Müller recognized the tactical signature. Siberians. The same divisions that had taken Tikhvin from him were now coming to finish what they had started. And somewhere among them, he knew, was Sergeant Alexei Volkov. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who understood this was the end. They had no reserves, no support, no possibility of victory. They fought because fighting was what soldiers did. Because surrendering twice seemed obscene. Because the alternative was to simply stop and let the cold take them. Müller's position held through the morning. The barn provided good cover and clear fields of fire. Otto directed fire with the calm precision of a man beyond fear, picking targets, conserving ammunition, killing efficiently. The bodies began to pile in the snow beyond their position. Soviet soldiers who had been unlucky or careless, or simply in the wrong place when bullets found them.
But the Soviets were patient.
They probed, tested, withdrew when fire became too heavy, then attacked from a different angle. They were not in a hurry. Time was their ally. Cold was their ally. Ammunition shortages and exhaustion and hopelessness were their allies. By noon, the German position had contracted to the central square and 3 surrounding buildings. 80 men that morning, perhaps 50 now. The wounded lay in a barn where no medical supplies existed, dying quietly, some calling for mothers, some silent, all beyond help. The afternoon brought the house-to-house fighting that Müller had learned to dread. Soviet infantry infiltrated through ruined buildings, clearing rooms with grenades and close-range fire. The barn fell first, its defenders overwhelmed by a coordinated assault that left no survivors. The eastern buildings fell next, their positions untenable once flanked. By evening, Müller and the remnants of his squad had withdrawn to a stone church at the center of the square, the only building with walls thick enough to resist Soviet fire. 30 Germans crowded inside, among them Otto, Hauptmann Dietrich, and a collection of soldiers who had ceased to be individuals and become simply survivors. The Soviets surrounded the church, but did not immediately assault. They could wait. They had time. The Germans had nothing except the rounds in their weapons and the certainty that tomorrow would not come for most of them. That night, In the frozen darkness of the church, where no candles burned and no prayers were said,
Müller sat against a wall and thought about the strangeness of fate. He had taught history to boys who would never become men. He had married a woman he might never see again. He had led soldiers into battles that achieved nothing except adding names to casualty lists. And now he was going to die in a church in a country he had never wanted to invade, fighting for objectives that no longer made sense, if they ever had. Otto appeared beside him, materialized from the darkness like a ghost. Tomorrow they will finish it. Herr Hauptmann, I know. I have one round left in my pistol. When the time comes, I will not be taken alive again. Müller said nothing. Every man had to make his own calculations about what was bearable and what was not. You are a good officer, sir. Better than most I have served under. You tried to keep us alive. It is not your fault that Russia does not care about trying. Thank you. Otto. The old sergeant faded back into the darkness, leaving Müller alone with thoughts that circled endlessly. He wondered if Greta would receive news of his death, or if he would simply vanish. Another name on a list of missing, presumed dead. He wondered what the students he had taught were doing, if they even remembered Herr Müller, who spoke about Roman legions and Germanic tribes. He wondered if any of this had mattered, or if history would record these events as a footnote to a larger catastrophe. Dawn came gray and cold. The temperature had dropped to -42 degrees Celsius. The Soviet assault began without preliminary bombardment, a silent advance of white-clad soldiers moving through the ruins like specters. The Germans fired from church windows, from the bell tower, from every position that offered a field of fire. They made each shot count because ammunition was measured in single digits. Now, Soviet soldiers fell, but others came behind them, relentless, patient, unstoppable. The church walls absorbed impacts. Stones spalled and cracked. A mortar round, perfectly placed, collapsed part of the roof, crushing 3 men beneath. Another round penetrated the nave, exploding among the defenders, killing and wounding in equal measure. Müller fired his last rounds, threw his last grenade, then drew the Luger pistol that was all that remained. Otto fought beside him, face serene, having made peace with whatever came next. Hauptmann Dietrich fell with a bullet through his throat, drowning in his own blood, eyes wide with surprise that death had finally found him. The Soviet infantry breached the church. They came through windows and doors, through the hole in the roof, through every opening. The fighting became primal. Bayonets and rifle butts and hands seeking throats. Men grappled in the darkness, fell together, died together. Müller found himself facing a Soviet soldier, young, Asiatic features, rifle raised. They stared at each other for a frozen moment. 2 men who might have been friends in another life. Enemies only because maps and politicians said they should be. The Soviet fired. Müller felt the impact like a hammer to his shoulder, felt himself falling, felt the pistol slip from numbed fingers. He lay on the stone floor, unable to move, watching the battle rage above him with the detached interest of someone no longer participating. Blood pooled beneath him, warm against the cold stone. He thought this must be what dying felt like. Not painful, exactly, just distant, fading. Then a figure stood over him, rifle pointed at his head. Müller looked up, vision blurring, and recognized the weathered face, the Mongol features, the patient eyes. Sergeant Volkov. The Siberian stared down at him, rifle unwavering, finger on the trigger. A simple pull, and it would be over. Mercy for a man who had fought twice, surrendered once, escaped, and fought again. Or perhaps justice for Soviet soldiers who had died taking this position. But Volkov did not fire. Instead, he lowered the rifle, knelt beside Müller, pressed cloth against the shoulder wound with professional efficiency. You again, German officer. You are either very brave or very stupid. Müller tried to speak, found his mouth filled with blood, coughed it out. Just unlucky. Volkov called for a medic, someone who might or might not arrive in time. He stayed beside Müller, applying pressure to the wound, doing what soldiers do for other soldiers. When the fighting pauses. What? Müller managed. Why not shoot? Volkov was silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. Because you have fought enough. Because I have killed enough. Cause the war will continue without you. And perhaps that is mercy. You will live. German officer. You will go to a prison camp, and you will survive if you are strong. And perhaps someday you will go home and tell your children that war is not what the songs say it is. A Soviet medic arrived, began working on the shoulder wound with supplies the Germans had not possessed in weeks. The pain was sharp now, breaking through the numbness, and Müller gasped. It will hurt, Volkov said, but you will live. The cold is what kills in Russia. Bullets merely wound. Remember that. Otto appeared, hands raised, disarmed, but alive. He looked at Müller, at Volkov, at the scene that might have been from some other war where mercy still existed. The Hauptmann is captured. He is captured. Volkov confirmed. And you? Otto nodded slowly. I surrender. Again, it is becoming a habit. The battle for the church ended with 30 Germans dead and 23 captured. The cost to the Soviets was not small, but they could afford it. Replacements came from inexhaustible Siberia, from cities the Germans had never heard of, from a land so vast that losses meant nothing. They carried Müller outside on a stretcher, into the pale December morning. The sky was heavy with clouds that promised more snow. The temperature remained locked at -40. The world was white and gray and red where blood had painted the snow. As they loaded him onto a truck, Müller saw the German positions being systematically cleared. Bodies were pulled from ruins and laid in rows. Weapons were collected and stacked. The collective farm that had been a battlefield was being transformed into a graveyard, somewhere among the Soviet soldiers moving through the ruins. Otto Brenner made a decision. He had survived 2 wars, 25 years of service, capture and recapture, and battles beyond counting. He had done his duty. He had kept his oath. He had tried to keep young men alive in a war that consumed youth with insatiable appetite. And now, watching the medics load Müller onto a truck, watching the last remnants of his platoon being herded into captivity, Otto decided he had endured enough. When the guards were distracted, when attention was elsewhere, Otto simply walked away, not fleeing, not running, just walking with the calm deliberation of a man who had made his choice. He walked into the forest, into the deep snow, into the -40 cold that had killed so many already. He found a tree, sat down with him back against it, and waited. The cold came quickly. Once movement stopped, it crept through his inadequate uniform, through skin and muscle, seeking the warmth of his core. His fingers went numb first, then his toes. Then the creeping numbness spread inward, like water filling a vessel. Otto did not fight it. He had seen too many men fight the cold and lose. Better to accept, to let go, to choose the moment rather than let the moment choose you. His last thoughts were of Bavaria, of the farm where he had been born, of his mother's face and the smell of bread baking and the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. Simple things, true things, things worth remembering. They found him, 2 hours later, frozen solid, face peaceful, having chosen his own end on his own terms. The Soviets buried him with the other German dead in a mass grave outside the collective farm. There was no marker, no ceremony, just the efficiency of men who had seen too many bodies to treat each one as sacred. But Otto would not have wanted ceremony. He had lived simply, fought simply, died simply. It was enough. Müller would learn of Otto's death later, in the POW camp, from another survivor who had watched the old sergeant walk away. The news came without drama, delivered by a hollow-eyed corporal who spoke in the monotone of someone beyond emotion. Feldwebel-Brenner walked into the forest. They found him froze. He looked peaceful. That was all, but it was enough. Müller grieved in the quiet way men grieve in captivity, with no tears and few words, carrying the weight of another loss, added to the accumulation of losses that defined this war. The truck drove east, away from Tikhvin, away from the sector where Müller had fought and lost, and fought again. He slept, or lost consciousness, or simply stopped caring about the difference. When he woke, they were at a collection point, a town he did not recognize, with buildings that had walls and roofs and fires that gave actual heat. A Soviet doctor, speaking German, learned before the war, examined his wound. "You are lucky. The bullet went through clean. No bones broken. No major vessels. You will heal if infection does not take you." Lucky, Müller thought. Yes, lucky to be alive when so many were dead. Lucky to be warm when Otto had frozen. Lucky to face years in captivity instead of a grave in the snow. So very lucky. While Ernst Müller was being processed as a prisoner of war, while Otto Brenner's body was being buried in frozen ground, while the remnants of German forces withdrew from the Tikhvin sector in disarray, a different story was unfolding to the west. The Soviet counter-offensive, which had begun with probing attacks and infiltration, now exploded into full fury. The 65th Siberian Rifle Division, the same unit that had captured Müller, pressed forward with relentless momentum. They were joined by the 4th Guards Rifle Division, by the 92nd Rifle Division, by artillery batteries and ski battalions, and every resource the Leningrad front could scrape together. At the head of one assault column, Sergeant Alexei Volkov led his squad through the forests south of Tikhvin. They moved in the pre-dawn darkness of December 15th, white shadows against white snow, invisible until the moment they opened fire. Volkov had been fighting for 5 months. Since the first German shells fell on Soviet positions in June, he had retreated across hundreds of kilometers, watching his country burn, watching his comrades die, learning the bitter lessons of defeat. But something had changed at Tikhvin. The Siberians had arrived, bringing with them the confidence of men who belonged to winter rather than merely endured it. The tide had turned, and Volkov could feel it in his bones. His squad numbered 5 now, down from the original 8. Dmitri and Yevgeny had fallen in the assault on the collective farm. Pyotr had taken a bullet through the lung and been evacuated. Probably dead by now. That left Volkov, Mikhail,
Boris,
Stepan, and Ivan. 5 Siberians who moved through the taiga like wolves through their territory. They had been born to this. The cold that killed Germans was merely weather to them. The snow that bogged down enemy columns was their highway. The forest that seemed alien and hostile to invaders was home. They reached a German supply depot at dawn, a collection of trucks and warehouses that represented the last functioning logistics node in the sector. The guards were half frozen, more concerned with survival than security. Volkov's squad hit them from 3 directions simultaneously, killing the sentries before they could raise an alarm. The depot fell in minutes. They burned the trucks, destroyed the supplies, cut the telephone lines. Another artery severed, another step toward reclaiming what had been stolen. As they withdrew into the forest, Volkov looked back at the burning depot, at the black smoke rising into the gray sky. Somewhere in that smoke was German hope, German supply, German confidence, all of it turning to ash. The offensive continued for 10 days, each day bringing German positions under mounting pressure. Each day, pushing the invaders farther from Tikhvin. The Wehrmacht, depleted by cold and combat, and the logistics nightmare of fighting in winter, could not hold. Positions that had been bought with blood were abandoned. Towns that had been captured at terrible cost were evacuated. The vaunted German war machine, which had swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, was learning what Napoleon had learned, what Charles XII had learned, what every invader learned eventually. Russia does not merely defend, Russia absorbs, and then it crushes. On December 23rd, Soviet forces entered the outskirts of Tikhvin proper. The Germans had withdrawn in stages, fighting, delaying actions, buying time for an organized retreat that became less organized with each passing hour. The cold made everything harder. Vehicles broke down. Men collapsed from exhaustion and exposure. The withdrawal became a rout. The rout became a catastrophe. And the catastrophe became simply the way things were. Volkov's squad was among the first to reach the railway station. The objective that had cost so many lives to capture, and now was being retaken. The building was mostly intact, though scarred by artillery and fire. The German flag that had flown from its roof was gone, torn down in haste or blown away by wind. Soviet soldiers moved through the town cautiously, clearing buildings, checking for stragglers or booby traps. But the Germans were gone, fled west, back toward positions they might be able to hold, back toward supply lines that still functioned, back toward anything except this frozen hell at the end of the world. In the ruins, Volkov found evidence of the German occupation, abandoned equipment, frozen bodies that had not been buried, personal effects scattered in the snow, photographs and letters, and the small artifacts of lives interrupted. He found a German helmet with a bullet hole through it, picked it up, examined it with professional curiosity. Some German soldier had worn this, had perhaps thought himself invincible, had learned too late
that steel offers no protection against certain kinds of death.
Volkov set the helmet down, moved on. There was no satisfaction in victory, only the grim acknowledgement that the task was complete, the objective achieved, the price paid. December 25th, 1940, Christmas Day. While Müller sat in a POW camp, eating thin soup and contemplating survival, while Otto Brenner lay frozen in an unmarked grave, while German forces continued their retreat westward, Soviet flags were raised over Tikhvin. The ceremony was brief. A Colonel Volkov did not know, gave a speech about the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the inevitable triumph of the motherland. Men who could barely stand at attention listened with faces that showed exhaustion more than triumph. When the speech ended, when the flags hung limp in the still air, the soldiers dispersed to find shelter, to find warmth, to rest if rest was possible. Volkov stood in the town square, watching snow fall on ruins that looked no different for being liberated. Tikhvin was free, but at what cost? His division had lost nearly 40% of its strength. Every unit told similar stories. Thousands dead, thousands more wounded. The town was a graveyard decorated with flags, but the railway was open. Supplies could move again. Leningrad could be fed. However meagerly, in the mathematics of total war, thousands of deaths were acceptable if millions could be saved. Cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. An officer approached with orders. The 65th Siberian Rifle Division was being redeployed south to a city on the Volga River that was growing in strategic importance. A city called Stalingrad. Volkov nodded, accepted the orders, began the mental preparation for the next battle. The war was not over. It had barely begun. But something had changed at Tikhvin. The Wehrmacht had been halted, pushed back, defeated for the first time in 6 months of constant retreat. The Red Army had proven it could not merely resist, but reclaim. That would have to be enough. In Leningrad, 200 kilometers west, Anna Volkov sat in the basement of Hospital Number 17, monitoring her illegal radio, waiting for confirmation of news she had heard as rumor. When the official broadcast came, she could barely believe it. Tikhvin has been liberated by Soviet forces. The encirclement is broken. The first supply convoy is moving today. The city will survive. Anna did not cheer. She had seen too much death, too much suffering, to believe that liberation meant the end of hardship. The siege would continue. People would still starve. The bombing would still come. But now there was supply, however limited. Now there was hope, however small. She thought of the broadcast she had made, speaking into the darkness, calling for someone to save them. Had anyone heard? Had it mattered? She would never know. But Tikhvin was free, and that was enough. That evening, as she made her rounds among patients who still suffered despite liberation, Anna allowed herself a moment of something that might have been hope. Her husband was dead. Her city was dying. Her own survival was uncertain. But Leningrad still stood. The railway was open. And in the mathematics of this war, that represented something like victory. On Christmas night, in 3 separate locations, 3 people who would never meet contemplated the same battle and drew different conclusions. Ernst Müller, in a POW camp 300 kilometers east of Tikhvin. Wrote a letter to Greta he did not know would ever reach her. He wrote about Russia and cold and battles that achieved nothing. He wrote about soldiers who had believed, and soldiers who had doubted, and soldiers who had died, believing the lies they needed to survive. He wrote about surrender and mercy and the strange humanity that sometimes appeared between enemies when the fighting paused. He did not write about coming home because he did not know if that was possible. He simply wrote that he was alive, that he thought of her, that somewhere in the mathematics of war and captivity and survival, love still mattered, even if nothing else did. Alexei Volkov, in Tikhvin, in a commandeered building that provided minimal shelter, sat cleaning his rifle with the meditative care of a man who understood that weapons were more reliable than hope. He thought briefly of the German officer, the one he had captured twice and spared twice. He wondered if the man would survive the camps, if he would return home, if he would remember the Siberian sergeant who had chosen mercy when revenge was easier. Probably not. War was forgetting as much as remembering. Men died and were buried and were replaced, and life continued until it did not. But on this Christmas night, in a town that had been won and lost and won again, Volkov allowed himself one small acknowledgement of something beyond tactics and duty. He had fought well. His men had fought well. They had taken back what was theirs, and they had done it in winter. Russia's ancient ally. That would have to be enough. The snow continued falling. The cold continued biting. And somewhere in the vast distance between Tikhvin and Munich, between memory and hope, two soldiers carried the weight of what they had seen, what they had done, what they had survived. Anna Volkov, in Leningrad, broadcast one final message that night before dismantling her equipment for the last time. The NKVD was closing in. She had been warned by a sympathetic doctor. One more broadcast, and she would be arrested. But there was one more message that needed to be said. This is Leningrad calling. This is the voice of a city that has chosen to live. Today, Tikhvin was liberated. Today, the railway reopened. Today, we received word that supplies are moving. We have survived the worst winter in memory. We will survive whatever comes next. To those who fought for Tikhvin, to those who died for it, to those who will never know how many lives they saved, we say this: you are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. Leningrad stands because you stood. The motherland endures because you endured. And though the siege continues, though the suffering persists, we know now that we will live. We will live. Because you made it possible. She shut down the transmitter, hid it for the last time, and walked upstairs to continue her work. There were patients to tend, wounds to dress, lives to save if lives could be saved. The war would continue. The siege would continue. But Tikhvin was free. And that small fact made the impossible seem merely difficult. The Battle of Tikhvin ended on December 25th, 1941. But its echoes would continue for years. In the memories of survivors, in the strategic calculations of generals, in the slow recognition that the Eastern Front would not be a repeat of France or Poland, that this war would be measured not in months, but in years, not in kilometers, but in blood. Ernst Müller would spend 4 years in Soviet captivity. He would survive through stubbornness and luck, and the help of other prisoners. who remembered what it meant to be human when conditions demanded they become animals. He would return to Munich in 1949, thin and scarred and changed in ways that could not be measured. He would find Greta waiting, older but patient, having survived her own war of hunger and bombing and uncertainty. They would rebuild a life from fragments. He would teach history again, but differently. Now, speaking not of glory, but of cost. Not of victory, but of survival. Not of certainty, but of the terrible ambiguity of men doing terrible things for reasons that seemed right at the time. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the wind howled like it had in Tikhvin, he would remember Klaus believing to the end, Otto walking into the snow, Werner choosing the bullet, Friedrich dying while calling for his mother. He would remember the town they had taken at such cost and held for so little time, the victory that had meant everything and nothing. And he would remember Sergeant Volkov, the enemy who had shown mercy twice, and he would wonder if mercy was the only thing that made war bearable, the only thing that preserved some fragment of humanity in the machinery of mass death. Alexei Volkov would die at Stalingrad in August 1942, killed by a German sniper during the fighting for the grain elevator. He would be buried in a mass grave with 200 other Soviet soldiers, his name recorded in a ledger that would survive the war. The rifle, with its careful notches, would be lost in the rubble, but his legend would persist among the survivors of the 65th Siberian Division. The sergeant who fought Tigers and Germans with equal competence and equal respect. His family would receive a letter stating he died a hero of the Soviet Union, defending the motherland against fascist invaders. They would keep the letter in a place of honor. They would tell his story to children and grandchildren, editing out the complexity and doubt and moments of mercy that might complicate the narrative. Anna Volkov would survive the Leningrad siege, though barely. She would lose her illegal radio. Would nearly be arrested by the NKVD, would watch thousands more die in the months that followed Tikhvin's liberation. But she would survive. She would continue working at Hospital Number 17 through the entire siege, through the terrible winter of 1942, through the gradual easing of conditions in 1943, through the final breaking of the blockade in January 1940. She would be awarded medals she never wore, cited for heroism she did not feel, celebrated as a survivor when she felt more like a ghost. She would work at Hospital Number 17 until 1975, retiring at age 58, having spent 34 years tending to wounds, both physical and otherwise. She would die in 1989, peacefully, in her sleep, in the city she had refused to abandon. Her obituary in the local paper would mention her service during the siege, would note her decorations and her years of dedication, but would not mention the illegal broadcasts, the words spoken into darkness, the voice that had insisted Leningrad would live when death seemed certain. Tikhvin itself would survive the war, be rebuilt, return to being an ordinary Russian town with ordinary Russian lives. The railway junction would continue carrying freight and passengers, no longer a military objective, but simply infrastructure. The economic lifeline it had been, before politics and armies made it something more. Monuments would be raised to the defenders, granite and bronze markers that spoke of heroism and sacrifice. The German graves would be consolidated, marked, eventually, mostly forgotten, and history would record the Battle of Tikhvin as a footnote to larger events, a small engagement in a vast war, notable only because it marked the first major Wehrmacht winter defeat, the first crack in the edifice of German invincibility. But for those who fought there, for the survivors who carried Tikhvin in their bones and dreams and waking nightmares, it was not a footnote. It was everything. It was the place where summer's certainties died, in winter's embrace. It was the town where victory tasted like poison and defeat looked like mercy. It was the battle where soldiers on both sides discovered that war's great lie is not that it makes men cruel, but that it sometimes allows them to remain human, and that small mercy is perhaps all that stands between civilization and absolute barbarism. The snow fell on Tikhvin. The wind howled. Winter, patient and eternal, waited for the next war, the next invasion, the next generation of young men who would learn what their fathers learned, that Russia belongs to those who respect her, and those who do not respect her will be buried in her snow. And on quiet nights, when the wind carries voices from the past, perhaps Klaus still believes. Otto still walks calmly into the forest. Werner still clutches his photograph. Friedrich still calls for his mother. And all the ghosts of all the wars gather in the ruins to tell stories that the living have forgotten or never knew. Two soldiers, one winter, 41 days that changed the course of a war that would last 4 more years and consume millions more lives. One German teacher who learned that history is written in blood and taught in sorrow. One Russian hunter who understood that winter chooses sides and mercy has its place, even in the mathematics of total war. One Russian nurse whose voice in the darkness insisted that hope was not merely propaganda, but a choice. A daily decision to believe that tomorrow might be different than today. The Battle of Tikhvin ended on December 25th, 1941. But in the hearts of those who fought there, in the calculations of generals who drew different lessons, in the slow recognition that this war would not end quickly or easily, the battle continued. It continued in Ernst Müller's classroom in Munich, where he taught students about the cost of hubris. It continued in the stories told about Alexei Volkov in Siberian villages, where his name became shorthand for competence and mercy in equal measure. It continued in Leningrad's hospitals, where Anna Volkov tended to wounds and remembered when survival itself was a form of resistance. The Battle of Tikhvin was not the largest engagement of the Second World War. It was not the bloodiest, not the most strategically significant, not the most remembered, but it was the first time the German war machine learned that will and discipline and superior tactics could not overcome distance and cold and the stubborn refusal of an enemy to accept defeat. It was the first crack in the myth of invincibility, the first proof that blitzkrieg had limits, the first indication that the war in the East would be measured not in weeks, but in years, not in rapid advances, but in grinding attrition. From that frozen town in northern Russia, from those 41 days of fighting in November and December 1941, from the graves of thousands who fell on both sides, a new kind of war emerged. Not the clean, surgical campaigns of Poland and France, not the swift victories of military theory, but something older, something primal, something that Napoleon had faced, and Hitler would face, and that Russia had always understood. The war of spaces and winters, and people who would not surrender, even when surrender was rational. The war that could not be won by tactics alone, that required endurance and will, and the acceptance that victory might simply mean survival. And in the end, perhaps that was the lesson of Tikhvin. Not that the Germans were weak, or the Soviets were strong, not that winter was decisive, or that one side was righteous and the other evil. But that war, stripped of its propaganda and mythology and comforting narratives, was simply this: men in terrible conditions, doing terrible things for reasons they hoped were good, learning too late that hope was not enough, that belief was not enough, that even victory might taste like ashes when the cost was counted. The snow falls on Tikhvin. The wind howls. The ghosts tell their stories. And history, patient and eternal, waits to see if we have learned anything at all. Ernst Müller, teaching in Munich. Alexei Volkov, sleeping in a mass grave at Stalingrad. Anna Volkov, tending wounds in Leningrad. Klaus Reinhardt, believing to the end. Otto Brenner, choosing his own ending. Werner Schroeder, holding his daughter's photograph. Friedrich, calling for his mother. All of them part of a story that had no heroes, only survivors, no villains, only men doing what they thought they must. No meaning except what we choose to give it in retrospect. The Battle of Tikhvin, where empires learned they could bleed, where winter chose sides, where mercy flickered briefly in the darkness of total war, where two soldiers, one German and one Russian, discovered that the enemy was not each other, but the cold and the waste and the terrible machinery that ground men into statistics, where a nurse's voice in the darkness insisted that hope was not naive but necessary, that survival was not weakness but strength, that Leningrad would live because people chose to make it live. 41 days, thousands of deaths, one railway junction, and the slow, terrible recognition that this war would consume a generation before it ended, that the road to Berlin ran through Moscow and Stalingrad and Kursk and 1,000 other places where men would learn that courage was not enough, that ideology was not enough, that even the most powerful military machine ever created could be stopped by distance and winter and the stubborn refusal to die. The snow falls, the wind howls, the lesson is written in blood on frozen ground, and we who read it from the safety of history must remember that every name on every casualty list was a universe, a life, a person who loved and feared and hoped and died far from home. In a war they did not start for reasons that made sense at the time and seem incomprehensible now. That is the true story of Tikhvin. Not victory or defeat, not tactics or strategy, but the simple, terrible truth that war consumes everyone it touches. And the only grace is the small mercy we sometimes show each other in the spaces between the killing.